In this lecture, I'm going to go over how three students have developed their projects in the last couple of assignments associated with Project 1 in Arch 101. This first project was done by Danny Jarabek. Now, for A9, you are to rethink the figures. So this is where you can start to make changes to your figures in order to make the composition stronger. Just like the fields in your previous assignments started to relate to the figures can also respond to the fields that you've developed. Now in this example, Danny really developed a very strong sense in his figures, and I think they actually could be a lot simpler, but this is one where the figures are a little more articulated. So for A9, you will be drawing a plan of one of your quadrants that you choose to study, and you can see that here. And here, he's obviously rethinking his figures. You can see that they're starting to develop a cross theme in them. You will also draw a plan oblique of that same quadrant, trying to continue to develop the figures. Now, before you do these two drawings, you should probably make sketches of them in your sketchbook in order to figure out what you would like to do. You can also develop your ideas in a sketch model at your desk, or on trace paper. Danny then developed the other three quadrant figures in his sketchbook before completing a model of the entire ensemble. So in this project, we're also allowing you to use the model from A7, so you don't have to redo the entire model. You simply can remove your figures, edit them, change them, add new figures to the base. And this is so that you can spend more of your time on developing the figures rather than just making another well-crafted model. Before you take the figures off of A7, though, you should document it. And you can see the model here. So this is what I would consider to be a sketch model. So it is not exactly perfect. It is definitely where a student is developing some ideas. You can see here that he has a theme throughout. So the figures are starting to use these very narrow pieces that span the figures, and you can see that that is repeated. That is one way that this holds together well. He's also developing a way where his figures have a centralized theme. So here, these figures are using the vertical and the horizontal axis to develop a very central theme. This one also has a very central theme, and I would say this one as well. Now for A10, you can continue to change your figures, but they probably will not change as much as your fields or your site. So in the final piece of this project, you're going to develop the connections between the figures and between the quadrants. We're going to be calling these paths. You can call them connections, but you should develop these as these yellow bands, and this is what is really tying the entire composition together. You will also be adding half walls. So in this plan, I can't really tell where the half walls are. It looks like these may be two, but we will see it in the model. So here you can see one of those walls right here. So these half walls are going to reinforce these paths or these connections between the figures. And then you can see the final model here. You should pay close attention to the requirements for A9 and A10. I'm not talking about each of the requirements right now in this lecture. I'm simply trying to talk you through how some students have developed their projects. The next example I'm going to talk through is Christian Macias's project from last year, A9 and A10. So you can see here, this is where he started looking at the plan for one of his quadrants. You can see that Christian probably has the same issue that a lot of you have, in that his figures and his fields are very centrally located, and so they're not extending to the edge of his quadrants, which is going to make it a little difficult to connect. Christian chose to keep his figures fairly simple. I think this is just fine. I actually don't think that the figures need to have a whole lot of, I would say, um, unnecessary additions made. They just need to be clarified, walls made that help you make connections between the figures, that sort of thing. They also should be relating to the fields that surround them and how they're able to connect spatially with the ground and with the remaining site. Here you can see his figures as one model where he added new figures to his model from A7. Again, his biggest problem still is connections across. So at this point, I would say this project is not doing such a great job at connecting it throughout the entire composition. He does have some strong ideas in terms of connections within his figures. So for instance, up here you can sort of see this implied connection here. So this wall is actually aligning with the edge of this wall. So there's an implied connection between these two figures. I think that's very strong. These are building off some symmetry that is already in his compositions. And then you can see here these walls are pulled back to align with those. And then when he did his A10, he really did do a great job at making connections between all four quadrants. So his paths are broader, they're not as narrow, they're sort of larger spaces. You can see that his placement of the half walls, so this is a half wall, this is a half wall, this L shape is a half wall, this vertical, and then this other L are half walls. Those are really emphasizing the directionality and the fields that he has chosen to develop. You can see here that his paths run through his figures. I think that is working really well for him in order to show how it actually really connects inside each of the figures. And notice that he also uses a wall up here in the corner to stop a path. So he doesn't do this in all places. That may have been something that he could have looked at, but that's another interesting idea in terms of stopping the path. And then you can see his plan oblique of one of his quadrants for his final. And then this is his final model. And you can see here that he has roofs that come on top of the paths at times. So his paths really go in and out and throughout his entire composition. Finally, we're going to look at Amanda Metz's example of A9 and A10. So in her project, she actually did start out with a figure with a quadrant that had fields that did extend to the edge. Hers was a very asymmetrical composition, and here you can see her plan oblique of that field that of the figures that she's redesigning. Here you can see that her figures actually became quite large. So the way that she used her roof pieces, the flat pieces that sort of span some of her figures, really started to make these look like very large figures. So she started to tie all of her figures together. And then in the way that she developed her paths, I thought this one was really interesting because her paths are really pushed to the exterior and the center is left as a void. And so her paths really go along the outside of her figures. And you'll also notice that her figures or her field conditions are very, like this one and this one are just about the same size. So they're sort of mirrored. And the paths really take a secondary role in her project. Here you can see her plan oblique. And then this is her model. There are also examples on Canvas. I would encourage you to look at them. I hope that talking through 3 students and how they develop their projects will help you as you develop your project over the next couple of weeks.